Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General bringing you some more Total War Warhammer 2 Legendary Lord lore. And today we are taking a look at the new upcoming free DLC Lord, Lokhir Fellheart, for the Dark Elves. Now, Lokhir was born to ply the rolling seas to bring fire and terror to the Warhammer world. His family had long had ties to the oceans around Nagaroth and around Ulthuan itself. In fact, his great-great-great-great-grandfather was the first of them all to captain a Black Ark. Now, Black Arks are essentially massive floating fortresses. They are from when the cities of Nagaroth were split apart from the main elven island of Ulthuan during an event known as the Sundering, where the king of the Dark Elves, Malekith, tried to end the world, but instead just brought great suffering to everybody. Now, the first of these Fellhearts to captain a Black Ark didn't go particularly well. In fact, we're talking about the year negative 2425 of the Imperial calendar. So around 5,000 years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline. In this year, the Black Ark of his great-great-great-great-grandfather, the Palace of Joyous Oblivion, was sunk, and it had been such a force on the seas that it actually unbalanced the whole of power on the oceans around the Warhammer world. From that day forward and for many centuries to come, the High Elves would have dominion over the oceans because the Dark Elves lacked the power to fight back. Over time, Malekith decided to try and amend this fact, and he built up his naval forces, establishing the city of Karondkar around the year negative 2016. Now, this city became the primary shipbuilding city for the Dark Elves. Of course, they weren't building the ships themselves, they were relying mainly on slave labor to do that kind of tedious work for them, but this is where most of their fleet came out, and by the year negative 1599, after 400 years or so of shipbuilding, they were ready with an invasion fleet, and they took off back to Ulthuan, and for a time had conquered large swathes of the High Elves Island. Now, this leads us to perhaps the sort of next most famous person as we walk down the history of the Fellheart name, and that is Menorith. Now, Menorith Fellheart, like his forebearer, also commanded a Black Ark, but his was one that would continue to be passed on, known as the Blessed Dread. Now, during the invasion of the Dark Elves to Ulthuan, they were eventually fought back, and they were fought back to an area known as the Blighted Isles. Now, this is where they made their final stand, and where a new Phoenix King had emerged and was leading a huge armada of elven ships. And the Dark Elves were going to try and stand their ground and keep their foothold in Ulthuan to continue the invasion and hopefully win the day. This immense naval battle would become known one day as the Battle of the Waves. Now, Menorith Fellheart was in charge of leading the naval defense of the Blighted Isles against this High Elf armada, and as they closed in, the two ships began raining down bolts onto each other's ships. It was said to be the most closely fought and bitter naval battle that had ever occurred between the Dark Elves or the High Elves, and arguably to this day, perhaps still that has ever occurred between the two mortal enemies. Now, despite some fierce tactical maneuvering, some great work, Menorith could not stop the High Elves making landfall, and they charged upon the shores of the Blighted Isles with most of the troops of the Dark Elves still on their Black Arks, on the ships, fighting, doing boarding raids, but not necessarily on the Blighted Isles themselves. Now, as the High Elves made sure, the Dark Elves were firing down from their ships, from the cliffs above the beachhead. They just rained down bolts and arrows upon the landing High Elves, causing the surf to turn red with blood, and then they charged the High Elves on the beach. So much blood had been shed in the open water, however, that it attracted a huge swarm of sharks who began to cause as many casualties as either side. But Malekith, mounted upon a manticore at this time, saw the carnage that was unfolding, realizing he had the majority of his troops still safe on the Black Arks, decided to abandon the Blighted Isles and return to Nagaroth, with a large part of his army and his navy intact. Now, Menorith distinguished himself so much he was actually put in charge charge of the Dark Elf Navy for that day forward, despite having lost the battle. He really did prove himself an absolutely gifted naval commander. Now, ever since then, Menarith is really the one who distinguished himself the most and really established the Fellheart family name and tied it into the naval hierarchy of the Druchii. Now, by the year 1103, so many centuries after the Battle of the Waves, which occurred around the year negative 691 to 93, it's not exact, and there are different sources that give different dates for the exact time that Malekith was driven from the Blighted Isles. So that happened around 400 years ago when another Fellheart rose to prominence, and that was Lokhir Fellheart. Now, she was a sly and cunning dark elf and used subterfuge to earn her infamy. What she ended up doing was tracking down high elf trading routes and following them around. Now, she achieved this shadowing by using the magic of sorceresses to hide her ship from the High Elf merchant fleet. Then one day she really hit pay dirt when she followed High Elf merchants all the way around the Southlands, past Ind, and for the Dark Elves discovered the route to Nippon and Cathay and all the riches they had therein, which were ripe for the raiding. They began to raid the coasts of both of these nations, gaining huge amounts of wealth in what were relatively unprotected cities, and really lifting the Fellheart family name from just those involved with naval command to one of the most powerful families in Dark Elf society, having amassed such a huge amount of wealth. Now, when she was done reaving down the coasts of these new hunting grounds, she returned back to Nagaroth and sold the charts on, multiplying her fortune yet again and really establishing them as one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most gifted at naval combat that the Dark Elves had ever seen. Now, one might presume that she might have perhaps kept a few charts back to, just keep for the Fellheart name so they can continue reaving and pillaging when they see fit for some rich neutral targets. From this point forward, as far as the Fellheart timeline and Lokhir's timeline itself, there are contradictions in the official army books and some of the lore, so I've just tried to piece together a rough idea of timing so that they make sense in the context of the way some of these stories have been told. So if you see dates that are a bit different from dates you've maybe seen in one source, remember there may be other sources that put it slightly differently. But really, Lokhir's adventures start in the year 1907 of the imperial calendar, some 500, 600 years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline. Now, Lokhir inherits command of the ship that's been in his family ever since Menarith, the Black Ark, the Blessed Dread. He inherits it from his father, who was struck down by an assassin's blade. Now, in normal Dark Elf society, one might presume that this assassin's blade would have been from Lokhir himself. The way that you climb the social tree in Dark Elf society, you tend to kill off your seniors, and you just take their place. It's all plotting, revenge, scheming, and murder in Dark Elf society, but this was not the case. For the Fellhearts are one of the few Dark Elf families that truly believe blood is thicker than water. They tend to stick together, they operate as a family unit, and they don't go around assassinating each other. So Lokhir receives his captainhood, and the first thing he does is, as with all change, there's a little bit of unrest amongst the crew. Maybe some people got a high idea of themselves that this boy, this younger chap, was taking over when perhaps they felt they were the more experienced sailor or what have you. Lokhir dealt with this pretty swiftly and decisively by deciding to round up all of the troublemakers and sacrificing them as his first command on the deck to Mathlin, and it's while stepping over a puddle of his first mate's blood that he gave the first command to set sail across the high seas from his Black Ark, the Blessed Dread. Now, it seems the first direction that Lokhir headed, having gained his command, was towards the hunting grounds of his ancestors, towards Cathay and Nippon and Ind. And it was, in fact, in the kingdom of Ind that Lokhir fell upon a temple to the god there called Gilgamesh. Now, in the temple, he was looting it and slaughtering all the priests therein, leaving sort of blood dripping from every conceivable surface within the temple. But he noticed out of the corner of his eye this kind of strange red glint, and as he approached, he saw a sort of fine statue made to the god out of a strange red metal. Now, fascinated by the entire thing, he took the statue back with him to Nagaroth, and there he had them forged into his 2 crimson blades that he would become renowned for the Warhammer world over. Now, this is believed to have happened around the year 2087, so he spent a good amount of time pillaging and reaving in Ind and Nippon and Cathay, and then kind of sort of returned home and spent a bit more time in Nagaroth. Now, around the year 2387, so 3 centuries after he's had his blades and was, I'm sure, had coated them in many an innocent's blood at this stage, he decided to earn a bit of a name for himself and take out an elven city. Now, he set sail from what had become his favourite haunt, the city of Karon-Kar, and he is indeed the Kraken Lord of Karon-Kar, known, as we mentioned before, for its massive shipbuildings, but also as well for its beastmasters, who break in many terrible beasts there and sell them on to the rest of the Druchii cities. But he was sailing out of Karon-Kar, moving down the coast, till he found the elven city of Tor Canabrae. Now, this city had long been known for making dragon ships, the largest and most imposing of the elven fleet. These were huge double-hulled ships with massive towers on the back, bolt throwers coated around the front, just real weapons of war, swift moving, very dangerous on the high seas indeed, and presumably to shut off this supply line, Fellheart had decided to target the city. He approached the city in the midst of a massive blizzard. Snow fell in its droves, and lightning streaked the air, and seemingly out of nowhere for the guards watching the walls of Tor Canabrae, one bolt of lightning lit up the night sky. There it was, the blessed dread, at their sea walls, bearing down upon them. Lokhir took no mercy and razed the entire city to the ground with the help of his corsairs, charging ashore and doing much of the slaughter. Now, this was perhaps one of the most notable victories in his early life, having shut down such a place of strategic importance for the High Elves. This really allowed the family name to spread even further, and he really established himself as the forerunner of the current Fellhearts, the heir to their naval dominance. Having gained a good amount of infamy from this taking and this razing in the city of Tor Canabrae, word gets around, and, when you're famous and you're very well known for your naval combat and getting around the world, people start to come to you with ideas and sort of stories they've heard. And it was when he got wind of one of these stories that Lokhir decided to sail south. Now, not many of his crew knew exactly where they were going. They sailed past the elven sort of colony of Arnheim, past the vampire coast where they were raided multiple times and had to many times fight off zombie hordes from getting onto his deck. Then they sailed even past that point of the vampire coast and eventually came to the sunken city of Chipeotl. Now here, Lokhir knew where he wanted to go, and he'd brought sorcerers along to help him with his quest. The sorcerers put magic on all his troops, allowing them to breathe underwater. And that's when they all started diving into the depths with their newfound ability to breathe underwater. However, out of the depths, something rose to face them. Aquatic descendants of the lizard men that plague Lustria emerged out of the darkness. Immense manta rays and a gigantic squid beast began to attack the Druchii as they continued to sink, trying to find this sunken city. The fighting was fierce and bloody. Plumes of ink and blood started to fill the water around them, but eventually the reaving corsairs of Lokhir Fellheart were victorious, and they sunk to discover the wonders of the sunken city of Chipeotl. Vast riches were to be found in this city, immense hoards of gold, stone plaques written by the old masters of the lizard men were discovered, as well as a number of different magical items. Now, some of these were rewards for his crew, some sold on, but one that caught his attention was a beautiful Kraken Mask, which he immediately placed upon his face and became the Lokhir Fellheart Fellheart we would see and recognize today, with his 2 crimson blades and his Kraken Mask. In the year 2408, Malekith approached Lokhir with a mission. He asked him to go and take the elven colony of Tor Elessor, located in the oceans far to the east. Now, having been around this part of the world, Lokhir didn't sort of hesitate, and he teamed up with another Black Ark known as the Immortal Agni. So his Black Ark, the Blessed Dread, and the Immortal Agni sail into the seas to go and take Tor Elessor. They arrive and they start to bombard the walls with magical missiles from the sorceresses they'd borrowed from the Dark Covenant. With their dark magic, the sorceresses managed to smash the walls apart to allow a flood of corsairs from both Black Arks to pour into the city, slaughtering every high elf before them. The high elves, however, fought valiantly, but they couldn't resist the sheer ferocity of the Druchii forces. In a single day, as the sun was setting, the whole city was drenched in blood and was nothing but a ruin. Lokhir himself took the lord of the city, a prince by the name of Dafsian, and pinned him alive to the highest walls in the city, the ones that surrounded the keep. There he left him to rot as Lokhir Fellheart sailed away, victorious yet again. So complete was their slaughter of this colony that not a single elf survived. No one was left to take word back to Ulthuan. No one was left to tell people the horrors that had transpired in this city. As such, after a while, Ulthuan, not having heard from one of their colonies, sent out the head of their fleet. They sent out Sea Lord Aisling to go and investigate, and he found nothing but rotting flesh and rampant decay around what was left of the city. Seeing this horror, he vowed to hunt down Lokhir Fellheart and set off on his mission to track down the Blessed Dread. It was another 9 years before the Sea Lord actually managed to catch up with Lokhir in the Sea of Serpents. Having spotted Lokhir's fleet from quite some distance away, he thought he had the element of surprise, and he tasked the mages on his ships to cloak their fleet. However, Lokhir is too able a seaman to fall for such a petty trick. The simple ripples on the water were not hidden, and they may as well have been sounding a horn and waving their flags, they were so obvious to the experienced and ruthless Admiral Fellheart. Then, knowing they were there, he set a plan into motion and simply bided his time, waiting for the High Elves to make the first move. And make the first move they did. The Sea Lord moved in his fleet and decloaked them, about to attack the Black Ark, the Blessed Dread. Lokhir, being ready, however, with perfect timing, opened up the back portal of the Ark and let out a fleet of Doomreaver ships, essentially fortresses tied to the backs of mighty sea dragons, as they poured forth in a black magical fog that he'd prepared to cloak them all coming out of the Ark itself. Taken by surprise, the Sea Lord was off guard, but he managed to command his smaller scatter ships, known as Hawk ships, to go around and attack these Doomreavers, take them on one-to-one, and his flagship, a dragon ship, a mighty 2-hulled vessel with fortresses and towers on the back itself, looked to engage with the larger Black Ark. It had the advantage of speed, but not of bulk when it came to facing off against one of these monstrosities. But the timing of the release of the Doomreavers was too good, and when the Hawks sailed into the fog, 2 were immediately smashed by the fire of the Doomreavers, and a third was broken in half with the swinging tail of one of these Helldrakes that dragged the towers along in the water. Despite the losses of these smaller ships, the dragon ship stayed the course and looked to engage Lokhir's Black Ark. They opened fire, doing minimal damage to the huge bulk that was the Black Ark itself. The Sea Lord at this point had a chance to escape the battle, but Lokhir knew his enemy well, and knew with the motivation of seeing all those corpses at the colony, the Sea Lord himself would be attacking and not relent. Eventually, the Sea Lord summoned forth one of his medium-tier ships, an Eagle ship, to come forward and engage the Doomreavers, helping out the Hawk ships who had already suffered losses. Then unleashed another volley of his dragon ship arsenal against the Black Ark. At this, Lokhir Fellheart just laughed at the ineffectualness of his weaponry against the mighty Blessed Dread. Then he signaled to the sorceresses, who had all this time been secretly gathering the winds of magic to them, and upon seeing Fellheart's signal, unleashed a storm of crystallized blades that they sent hurtling towards the dragon ship of the Sea Lord. The Sea Lord had mages of his own who tried to counter the spell, however, Lokhir had a plan for this. When he'd unleashed the fog, he'd let out a number of assassins tied to just drifting wood out into the ocean as well. Now, a number of these assassins actually succumbed to the deathly cold of the ocean at the time, but a number of them managed to be caught by the swinging dragon ship and had attached to their sides, climbing up the ship the whole time. And then as soon as the mages tried to counter the spell of the Blade of Storms, they leapt on board, cutting down all the mages they could, causing the blades to wash over the deck. Some of the assassins were also caught in the wake, but it mattered not. It was a strategic win for Lokhir. There was slaughter up on the deck. Most of the soldiers the Sea Lord had on deck had been sliced into naught but paste, and his sails had been completely destroyed. He was virtually dead in the water. All was not lost, however. He still had a lot of troops down below decks who'd been shielded from the worst of this storm of blades. So he signaled them to come onto deck to provide any cover from any boarding activity, but that had already begun. Lokhir was already in the second phase of his plan, and he launched the harpoons, which flied through the air, landing on the deck of the dragon ship, pulling tight and dragging it in towards the Black Ark. It was Fellheart himself to be the first to jump across the deck, cutting down several of the white lions as they stood in his way. The rest of his dreaded corsairs followed, two blades in hand, cutting and slicing at anything they could. The fighting was heavy on deck now. White lions, spearmen were coming face to face with these deadly corsairs as they fought in close quarters. Then, out of nowhere, an assassin leapt up to try and take out the Sea Lord, but the Sea Lord was a gifted fighter, and with a single sweep of his greatsword, managed to cut the assassin in two. But the High Elves were not winning this fight. The Druki were coming closer and closer, and soon it seemed like he was completely surrounded. But he was a gifted fighter and cut them down one after the other until there was a pile of dead Druki at his feet, until he heard a cry from the back of his ship to back off as Lokhir Fellheart approached and challenged the Sea Lord to a one-on-one duel. And so began a duel that would descend into legend. The two exchanged blow for counter blow over and over again. For nearly an hour they battled on the deck of the ship, moving, parrying, thrusting. Neither could get a clear advantage. The chaos of the battle had continued to unfold around them. The ships had been battling and sinking around them. A mighty sea creature had joined the fray and was sucking down one of the hawk ships in the background as this duel unfolded on the deck of the mighty dragon ship. The whole place had also taken alight, with flames starting to burn up the masts of the dragon ship itself, but it would not stop this duel. Nothing would interfere, not even all the carnage and chaos of the battle around them. Then, suddenly, it looked like the Sea Lord himself had gained the upper hand. With a wonderful parry, he'd actually managed to knock one of Fellheart's red blades out of his hand and sent it scuttling across the deck. Looking to take advantage, he swung down as Lokhir chuckled to himself. Slightly taken aback by this chuckling, he almost didn't notice as the blade, through some seeming magical source, came swinging back into Lokhir's hand. As he parried the Sea Lord's blow, rose and knocked his shoulder into the Sea Lord, unbalancing him and almost sending him toppling over the edge of the deck and into the freezing waters below. The Sea Lord managed to regain his footing with surprising grace. It even took Fellheart off guard as he in one blow recovered his footing and sliced down straight at the Druki Lord, almost too quickly for Lokhir to parry. The blade cut straight through his helm and into his skull. The Sea Lord, exhausted but relieved as he felt himself victorious. However, as he withdrew the blade, the metal of the mask itself, as well as the skull underneath, started to reknit themselves, healing almost instantaneously. What manner of dark magic was this, thought the Sea Lord to himself, as he again crashed down with all his force this time on the head of Fellheart. This time, although cutting deep into the skull again, the blade broke against the helmet of the Kraken. But he did manage to knock Lokhir off his feet. Looking desperately around for a weapon, the Sea Lord grabbed up one of the dropped axes from one of the White Lions, just to arm himself, and went charging back at Fellheart. Fellheart, recovering from the wound almost instantaneously, hamstrung one of his own men, causing him to tumble down to Lokhir's level, who then proceeded to throw the poor Druchii Corsair at the Sea Lord. The Sea Lord, having to react to this oncoming body being thrown at him, left himself wide open as Fellheart jumped high into the air and brought both his crimson daggers down straight into the chest of the Sea Lord of the High Elves. The Sea Lord tried to speak, but blood spewed forth from his mouth, and the axe fell from his hands. Lokhir then grabbed the handles of both his blade and gave a mighty kick to the chest of the Sea Lord, withdrawing both his crimson blades and sending the Sea Lord tumbling into the ocean below. He gave a hearty chuckle out as the Sea Lord went tumbling over the edge. And so Fellheart won the battle and won the duel. Only an hour later, having cleaned up the mess, the blessed dread, the mighty Black Ark, was back sailing through the oceans again, with its hull full of new slaves to take back to Nagaroth and to the slave pits of Karon Kar. However, one notable exception was that the body of the Sea Lord was never recovered from that particular fight. Now, it wasn't till many, many years later that Fellheart found out what happened to him, but basically he went missing for 6 months and was found washed up on the shores of Ulthuan. So a little bit of a mystery there about the Sea Lord, but that's what ended up happening to him. So following this, Lokhir's next great adventure was what was known as the Game of Reavers. While up in the Sea of Claws near Norska, Fellheart and another Black Ark captain by the name of Daston Coldeye decided to have a bit of a competition. They'd say to each other, you know what, let's each pick an empire province from up here in the north, and we will loot and plunder it for a year, and whoever has most plunder at the end of the year wins the game. They each picked one. Daston picked Nordland, and then Fellheart picked Ostland. The two of them set off rampaging in. Now, Daston took a massive early lead, because little did Fellheart know that the Imperial fleet stationed out of Nordland had just returned from a bit of a pillaging route themselves, where they'd been to the lands of Nehekara, the land of the Tomb Kings, and brought back vast amounts of treasure. Now, not knowing this, and maybe thinking Nordland was a bit of a challenge considering the navy is normally based out of there, Fellheart had made the wrong decision, and Daston went into a massive early lead, having picked up all this plundered treasure from Nehekara. Not to be dissuaded, however, Fellheart unleashed a merciless campaign of plunder. No village in northern Ostland was spared, and fear gripped the province as Fellheart and his Druchii Corsairs rampaged across the province for a full year. But as the end of year approached, Fellheart knew he still hadn't closed the gap from that early lead. The rest of his plundering had been much more fruitful than Daston's, but he had not quite beaten him yet, and so he did what any self-respecting Dark Elf would do: he cheated. He sent word down to Zandri, the land of the Tomb Kings, to King Akatep, and said, "Hey, Akatep, guess what? I know where a whole bunch of your treasure is that's been stolen. It's on this Black Ark in the Sea of Claws. Come and get it." And so the fleet of the Tomb Kings of Zandri set off to the north, and for many days pursued Daston, who was eventually caught and sunk. Daston Coldeye, however, did survive, but was forced to forfeit the competition due to not having his ship anymore. Now, having to forfeit, the stakes were higher than one might think. Daston and his immediate family were sacrificed to Mathlin, the god of the sea, and Loek, the trickster god, because without pulling off that trick, Fellheart knew he wouldn't have won the day and wouldn't have won the competition. So he sacrificed the family to the gods and kind of left it there, winning the day yet again through wonderfully nefarious Dark Elf means. Now, still to this day, with his Kraken Mask and his red crimson blades, he reaps and raves across the coasts of the entire Warhammer world, not limited by any distance, and he is still the scourge of the seas, committing countless other acts of piracy and murder, no doubt, and he has ensured that Lokhir Fellheart has, both in word and deed, eclipsed the glory of all his forebearers combined and amassed wealth beyond measure. He's maintained a rarity, loyalty of his men through a multitude of means. He's very generous, but he's also aware he has to lead by example, and as such has become a keen duelist, happy to take on the best of the best in challenges when he has to fight them, to gain the loyalty, fear, and respect of his men. Now at this point, Lokhir Fellheart could rest on his laurels, simply become a ruling lord of Nagaroth, but no. Breathing is in his blood, and he was born to ply the rolling sea and bring fire and terror. And that's about it for our lore on Lokhir Fellheart, guys. In terms of his rules on the tabletop, he has a couple, very similar to stuff we've seen him get in the game. The Kraken helmet on the tabletop does allow regeneration, and it does cause terror. Now, we've seen the effects of the Kraken Mask in Total War Warhammer 2 already. We know it does both of those things. He, unfortunately, it looks like, isn't getting his Crimson Blades as a magical item. On tabletop, what these did is they allowed him to re-roll wounding hits. So if he missed a wound, he'd be able to get a second chance to have a go at it, which is a pretty effective tool on the tabletop. It would equate to something like a big melee attack buff in Total War Warhammer 2. But unfortunately, it looks like he's not getting them as unique item, only getting his Kraken Mask as a unique quest item there, which is a little bit unfortunate if you ask me. On the tabletop, he also had something known as, I think it was like Leaping Dread or Great Leap or something, that would allow him to move positions within his regiment. It was also another handy one, but not an easy translation for Total War Warhammer 2 to deal with. But on the whole, I think they've done him a good service. He looks pretty good in the game, and I can't wait to get my hands on him. Very much looking forward to having him and an army of Corsairs reaping around the coasts of the old world, causing all kinds of havoc and carnage. But if you'd like some details, guys, on how he plays, do check out my Lord in Faction video I did on Lokhir Fellheart. It'll be popping up in the top right-hand corner now, in terms of how he will play in Total War Warhammer 2, or you'll find the link in the description below. Other than that, guys, as always, a huge thank you all for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys, bye.